The wandering Leviathan, the Galactic Concord, had existed for 10 million years, and in all that time they had seen everything, or so they believed. They had watched empires rise from nothing and crumble into dust, and they had witnessed weapons that could shatter entire moons into pieces, and they had recorded horrors so terrible that whole species chose extinction rather than face them. Again, 12,000 spacefaring civilizations had been catalogued in their archives, and the Concord believed. They understood power, and they believed. They understood war, and they believed that nothing in the universe could truly surprise them. Anymore, they were wrong. The day humanity arrived began like any other day in the heart of Concord space, where hundreds of species traded and negotiated and formed alliances that would last for centuries or fall apart within hours. Ambassador Kelveth of the Sithrani Collective was reviewing trade agreements in her private chamber when her assistant burst through the door with terror written across every feature of his scaled face. "Something has entered our space," he said, and his voice trembled in a way she had never heard before. Kelveth turned to the massive display screen that dominated one wall of her office, and what she saw made her heart stop beating for 3 full seconds. It was not a ship. Ships had elegant lines and recognizable designs and purposes that could be understood at a glance. But this thing defied all understanding. It was the size of a small moon, and it bristled with weapons that her computer could not identify, and it was wrapped in armor that seemed to drink in the light around it. And its surface was scarred with marks that told stories of battles fought in places no Concord species had ever been. The nomad had a rivet. Kelveth was the finest diplomat her species had ever produced, and she had brokered peace between civilizations that had hated each other for millennia, and she had never once failed to establish communication with a new species. She transmitted the standard greeting protocols that the Concord had developed over millions of years, and these protocols had been designed to work with any intelligent species, regardless of their biology or culture or level of technology. She waited. The response came after exactly 1 hour, and it was not what she expected. A single image appeared on her screen, and it showed a human child who could not have been older than 6 standard cycles, and the child was waving at the camera with a smile that showed missing teeth, and behind her through a viewport alien warships burned in the endless void of space. Kelveth stared at that image for a very long time. The message needed no translation, and it needed no explanation, and it said everything that needed to be said. "We do not fear you, and we have never feared you, and we never will." Concord's greatest military minds were summoned to an emergency session, and these were beings who had planned campaigns that spanned galaxies, and they had defeated enemies that threatened all life in the universe. And they had never encountered something they could not analyze and understand. They scanned the nomad with every sensor available to them, and they searched for weaknesses in its design, and they looked for vulnerabilities in its defenses. They found nothing. They calculated its firepower based on the energy signatures they detected in their instruments, returned errors that none of them had ever seen before, because the numbers were simply too large for their systems to process. They debated for 17 cycles while the nomad hung in space like a patient predator, and while humanity said nothing and did nothing and simply waited. The waiting was somehow worse than any threat could have been. Then the Vraxian hegemony decided they had seen enough. The Vraxians were ancient, and they were arrogant, and they had ruled their corner of the galaxy for longer than most species had existed, and they did not believe that anything could challenge their supremacy. They sent their legendary Death Fleet to investigate the newcomers, and this fleet consisted of 900 vessels that had conquered 43 star systems and had never known defeat. The fleet surrounded the nomad and transmitted demands for immediate surrender, and they threatened annihilation if compliance was not achieved. The nomad did not respond. The Vraxian commander ordered his fleet to move closer and to demonstrate their power by destroying a small asteroid that floated near the massive fortress. The nomad still did not respond. Commander grew frustrated, and he ordered his fleet into attack formation, and he prepared to teach these newcomers a lesson they would never forget. What happened next would haunt the Concorde for the next 1,000 years. The Nomad did not fire a single weapon, and it did not raise shields, and it did not even change course. It simply continued moving forward at the same steady pace it maintained since entering Concorde space, and the Death Fleet ceased to exist. There was no battle, and there were no explosions, and there were no cries for help or desperate last transmissions. There was just absence. One moment 900 warships surrounded the Nomad, and the next moment there was nothing but empty space where they had been, as if they had never existed at all. Calvith watched the sensor data in her office, and she felt something she had never felt before in her long career. She felt small, she felt insignificant, she felt like a child who had wandered into the territory of something so far beyond her understanding that she could not even begin to comprehend what she was seeing. Somewhere aboard that impossible fortress, she realized humans were probably going about their daily lives, and they were probably eating dinner with their families and playing games with their children and complaining about minor inconveniences and living completely ordinary lives. They had just erased the most feared armada in the galaxy, and they probably had not even noticed her assistant stood beside her, and he asked the question that every being in the Concorde was asking at that moment. What are they? Calvith shook her head slowly, and she thought about that image of the smiling child with the burning ships behind her, and she thought about the casual ease with which 900 warships had simply stopped existing. What kind of species builds something like this? She whispered. What kind of species looks at the universe and decides that it will never be afraid again? What kind of species carries its children through the void in a fortress that could destroy everything we have ever built? She did not have answers to these questions, but she knew one thing with absolute certainty. The galaxy would never be the same again. Humans had arrived, and nothing, and no one could make them leave. And the most terrifying part was that they seemed to have no interest in conquest or destruction or domination. They simply existed, and they simply moved forward, and they simply did not care what anyone thought about them. That indifference was more frightening than any weapon could ever be. The exodus that forged them, the truth about humanity, spread through the Concorde like a plague, and it infected every species with fear and wonder and a terrible understanding. Earth was gone, not conquered by an enemy fleet, and not destroyed by internal war, and not abandoned due to environmental collapse. Earth had been consumed. The humans called it the breach, and they spoke of it rarely, and when they did, their voices became quiet and their eyes became distant, and even the strongest among them seemed to shrink beneath the weight of the memory. 3 centuries ago, something had torn through the barrier between dimensions, and it had emerged in the Sol system where humanity had built their civilization over thousands of years. The thing that came through the breach had no name that human tongues could speak, and it had no form that human eyes could comprehend, and it had no purpose that human minds could understand. It simply consumed. The sun was the first to fall, and humanity watched in horror as their star was devoured like a candle flame snuffed out by an infinite darkness. Then the outer planets began to disappear one by one, and the moons vanished, and the asteroid belts were swallowed, and the thing grew larger with every world it absorbed. 14 billion human beings lived in the Sol system at that time, and they had 72 hours to decide whether they would die in their homes or fight for survival against something that could not be fought. They chose to fight not with weapons, because weapons were useless against something that existed outside normal reality, and not with diplomacy, because the thing did not communicate and did not negotiate, and did not even seem to notice that life existed around it. They chose to fight by refusing to die. In those final 72 hours, humanity did something that should have been impossible, and they did it through sheer determination and desperate genius and a stubborn refusal to accept extinction. They dismantled their dying moon, and they harvested materials from the corpse of their fading sun, and they tore apart space stations and orbital platforms in every ship they could find. They welded it all together into something new. The Nomad was born in fire and terror and grief, and it carried the last survivors of humanity into the void, just as the breach consumed the final remnants of their home system. 40 million people escaped on that impossible vessel, and they left behind everything they had ever known and everyone they had ever loved who could not make it aboard in time. They fled into the darkness between galaxies where no stars shone and no worlds existed and no hope seemed possible, and they survived. The first century was the hardest because they had to learn how to live in a universe that wanted them dead, and they had to build systems that could sustain them indefinitely, and they had to maintain their sanity while floating through an endless void of nothing. They developed new technologies out of desperation, and they created new social structures out of necessity, and they became something harder and stronger and more determined than they had ever been before. Then the hunters found them. The void between galaxies was not empty as the Concorde believed, and things lived there that had existed since before the first stars ignited, and these things noticed the tiny vessel of refugees crawling through their territory. The first attack came without warning, and creatures that existed partially outside normal space-time tore through the Nomad's outer hull and killed 3,000 people before the humans figured out how to fight back, but they did figure it out, and they won. The second attack came from an ancient civilization that had grown bored of their own galaxy and wandered the void looking for interesting things to destroy, and they saw the Nomad and decided it would provide entertainment for a few hours. The battle lasted 3 days, and when it was over, the ancient civilization no longer existed, and the Nomad had integrated their weapons into its own systems. This pattern repeated again and again over the next 2 centuries. Something would attack the Nomad, and the humans would suffer and die and grieve, and then they would learn and adapt and overcome, and they would emerge from each battle stronger than before. Every weapon they encountered became a lesson in how to build better weapons, and every defense they faced became a blueprint for better armor, and every enemy that tried to destroy them contributed to their evolution. They fought things that had no physical form, and they developed weapons that could harm pure energy. They battled entities that existed across multiple dimensions, and they created shields that could block attacks from outside normal reality. They survived encounters with beings so ancient and powerful that the Concorde would have surrendered immediately upon seeing them. By the time 300 years had passed, humanity was no longer the species that had fled a dying Earth. They had become something new and something terrifying, and something that the universe had never seen before. They were refugees who had transformed their grief into power, and they were survivors who had turned their trauma into strength, and they were wanderers who had made the void itself fear them. Nomad was no longer just a ship or a fortress or a mobile world. It was a monument to everything humanity had lost, and it was a weapon forged from 3 centuries of constant warfare, and it was a promise that humanity would never be victims again when they finally entered Concorde space. They did not come as conquerors seeking new territory, and they did not come as refugees begging for shelter, and they did not come as diplomats hoping for alliance. They came as something the galaxy had never encountered. They came as apex predators who had earned that title through blood and sacrifice, and they came as a species that had looked into the darkest parts of the universe and refused to blink. And the most unsettling part was that they were not proud of what they had become when humans spoke of their journey. They did not boast, and they did not celebrate. And they did not treat their transformation as a victory. They spoke of it as a tragedy. They had wanted to be explorers and scientists and artists and dreamers. Instead, the universe had forced them to become warriors, and they would never forgive the cosmos for that. The silence of giants' fear is a powerful force, and it can make intelligent beings do foolish things, and it can twist rational minds into paranoid spirals of suspicion and dread. The Galactic Concord had never been more afraid than they were in the months following humanity's arrival, and that fear began to poison everything they did and everything they thought. They held emergency councils where representatives from 1,000 species debated what the humans wanted, and they analyzed every scrap of data they had collected, and they constructed elaborate theories about humanity's true intentions. Surely, the humans wanted something because that was what power was for. Power existed to take things and to control things and to dominate things, and no species had ever possessed absolute power without using it to reshape the universe according to their desires. The Concord waited for demands that never came, and they prepared for invasions that never materialized, and they braced for ultimatums that were never delivered. The Nomad simply continued its slow journey through their space, and it stopped occasionally near uninhabited systems to harvest resources, and it never threatened anyone, and it never demanded anything. This silence was somehow worse than any aggression could have been. High Arbiter Morath of the Xinkai was the oldest living being in the Concord, and his species had been among the founders of the Great Alliance 10 million years ago, and he had personally witnessed the rise and fall of more empires than most species could imagine. He decided that someone needed to understand humanity, and he requested an audience aboard. The Nomad, expecting to be refused or ignored, the humans agreed immediately. A small shuttle carried Morath from his flagship to one of the Nomad's many docking bays, and as he approached the massive fortress, he felt a strange sensation that he had not experienced in millennia. He felt young. He felt small. He felt like a child approaching something so vast and ancient that his own considerable age meant nothing. The docking bay was clean and functional and surprisingly ordinary, and a human woman waited for him there with a warm smile on her face. She introduced herself as Lieutenant Chen, and she would be his guide during his visit. Morath followed her through corridors that hummed with energies his instruments could not identify, and he passed weapon systems that could have destroyed his entire fleet with a single shot, and he saw things that his scientific training told him should be impossible. But he also saw other things. He saw children running through hallways laughing and playing games, and completely unaware that they lived aboard the most powerful weapon in the known universe. He saw families eating meals together in small apartments that had been decorated with photographs and artwork and personal items that made them feel like homes. Saw old people sitting in gardens under artificial sunlight, tending to plants and talking about grandchildren and complaining about minor inconveniences. He saw humans arguing about music and disagreeing about sports and debating the best way to prepare food and living lives that were utterly ordinary and completely unremarkable. These were not conquering warriors or terrifying monsters. These were just people. The woman he was brought to meet was called Captain Yara Singh, and she was old by human standards, with silver hair and tired eyes and skin marked by years of service and sacrifice. She offered him something called chai, which was a warm beverage that her species enjoyed, and she asked if his biology would allow him to safely consume it. Morath accepted the drink because refusing hospitality would have been rude, and he found the taste pleasant, if somewhat strange. They sat together in a small room filled with books and plants and photographs of people who were probably family members, and Yara waited patiently for him to speak. "Why are you here?" Morath finally asked, because he could not contain the question any longer. Yara sipped her chai and considered the question carefully before responding. "We are passing through," she said simply, and her voice was calm and unhurried and completely without deception. "We saw that you had a nice civilization going here, and we thought we would say hello before continuing on our way." Morath blinked his secondary eyes in confusion, because this answer made no sense to him. That is all he asked. What else would there be? She replied, and she seemed genuinely puzzled by his confusion. "You have the power to rule this entire galaxy," he said, and his voice carried all the frustration and fear that had been building in the Concord for months. You could take whatever you desire, and you could reshape civilizations according to your will, and you could become gods among the stars. Why do you not use what you have? Yara set down her cup, and her expression changed to something that Morath had not expected. She looked sad, she looked tired. She looked like someone who had carried a heavy burden for far too long. We had a home once, Arbiter, she said quietly, and her eyes grew distant, as if she was seeing something far away. We had cities where children played in the streets, and oceans where families spent lazy summer days, and mountains that couples climbed together just to watch the sunrise. We had roots. Morath listened in silence. You know what we learned out there in the dark? She continued, and her voice was barely above a whisper. We learned that power does not give you back what you have lost, and it does not fill the emptiness inside you, and it does not make you happy or whole or completed. Just makes you more alone. She gestured toward the viewport, where stars wheeled slowly past in the eternal dance of the cosmos. We are not conquerors, Arbiter, and we have no interest in ruling anyone or controlling anything. We are just wanderers now. We are looking for something that we will probably never find. Morath felt something shift inside him as he listened to this ancient, tired woman speak. What if someone threatens you? He asked. Yara smiled, and it was a gentle expression mixed with something that might have been sorrow or might have been acceptance. Then we remind them why that is a very poor decision, she said, but we take no pleasure in it. We never have. Morath left the Nomad several hours later, and he carried with him a new understanding that unsettled him more than any threat could have. Humanity possessed absolute power, and they wanted nothing. They could have anything, and they asked for nothing. They were the most dangerous species the galaxy had ever encountered, and they just wanted to be left alone. That was somehow the most terrifying thing Morath had ever learned. The reckoning. The Vorn Imperium did not believe in gods because they had destroyed every being that ever claimed divine status, and they had consumed every civilization that had ever suggested there were powers greater than the Vorn Emperor. Thalax the Undying had ruled his empire for 6,000 years, and in all that time he had never encountered anything that could challenge his supremacy. He had absorbed countless species into his domain, and he had stolen their technologies, and he had grown his territory until it spanned 3 entire galactic arms. He looked upon the Nomad, and he saw not a warning but a prize if he could capture that fortress, and if he could claim the secrets that humanity had gathered over 3 centuries of wandering through the void. Then he would become truly immortal. He would become truly invincible. He would become everything he had always believed himself to be. His advisors counseled caution, and they reminded him of what had happened to the Vraxian Death Fleet, and they suggested that perhaps diplomacy might be a wiser approach. Thalax executed his advisors for their cowardice. He assembled a force unlike anything the galaxy had ever witnessed, because he was determined to prove that the Vorn Imperium feared nothing and no one. 12,000 warships gathered at his command, and each one was a masterpiece of destruction, capable of laying waste to entire star systems. He brought planet crackers that could shatter worlds into rubble with a single shot, and he brought sun eaters that could drain the energy from stars, and he brought living weapons grown in the corpses of dead gods from the early universe. His fleet surrounded the Nomad in a sphere of absolute destruction, and Thalax broadcast his ultimatum across all frequencies so that every species in the galaxy could witness his triumph. Surrender your vessel and your technology and your people, he declared, and his voice carried the absolute confidence of someone who had never known defeat. Submit to the Vorn Imperium, and you will be granted the honor of serving under my rule. Resist, and you will be erased from existence so completely that the universe will forget you ever lived. Nomad did not respond. Thalax waited for 1 hour, and then 2, and then 3, and still the human said nothing. Grew impatient because he was not accustomed to being ignored, and he ordered his fleet to begin a demonstration of power. 1,000 ships fired simultaneously at a nearby asteroid, and the rock vanished in a flash of energy so bright that sensors across the sector were temporarily blinded. Surely, now the humans would understand what they faced. The nomad still did not respond. Thalax felt something he had not experienced in 6,000 years. He felt doubt. He crushed that feeling immediately, because doubt was weakness and weakness was death, and he had not survived for millennia. By entertaining uncertainty, he gave the order to attack. 12,000 warships opened fire with everything they had, and the void between them and the nomad filled with enough destructive energy to sterilize 100 worlds. The weapons struck the nomad's hull, and they did nothing. No damage and no reaction, and no effect whatsoever. Fortress simply absorbed the assault like a vast ocean absorbing raindrops, and it continued its slow, steady movement forward as if nothing had happened. Thalax screamed orders at his commanders, and he demanded more power, and he threatened execution for anyone who failed him. His fleet fired again and again, and each assault was more desperate than the last, and each assault achieved exactly nothing. Then the nomad responded. It did not fire weapons, and it did not launch fighters, and it did not deploy any of the terrible technologies it had gathered over 3 centuries of wandering. It simply activated something. A pulse of energy rippled outward from the fortress, and it moved through space like a wave through water, and it passed through every ship in the Vorn fleet. For one moment nothing happened. Then everything happened at once. Every weapon pointed at the nomad turned inward and began firing on the ships that carried them. Every drive core inverted its energy flow and began consuming the vessels from within. Every living weapon turned on its handlers and began devouring the crews that had controlled them. 12,000 warships became 12,000 tombs in exactly 3 seconds. Thalax watched from his command throne as his entire fleet died around him, and he felt his certainty crumble into dust, and he understood for the first time in 6,000 years what it meant to be powerless. His flagship was the only vessel spared, and he realized with horrible clarity that the humans had done this deliberately. They wanted him alive. They wanted him to see. They wanted him to understand. That human appeared on his personal display screen, and it was a young woman with an unremarkable face and a calm expression, and she looked almost bored. "We know you can hear us," she said, and her voice was casual and unhurried, as if she was discussing something trivial. "We know you are still alive because we made sure of that." Thalax could not speak. "You are going to deliver a message for us," the woman continued, and now there was something cold beneath her casual tone. "Tell everyone what you saw to date. Tell them that we did not want this. Tell them that we asked politely to be left alone. Tell them that this was us being gentle." The display went dark. Thalax was found 3 days later drifting in an escape pod at the edge of what had been his territory. His empire was shattered, and his fleet was gone, and his reputation as the invincible ruler of 3 galactic arms had been exposed. As a hollow lie, he would spend the remaining centuries of his very long life in a monastery on a remote world, refusing to speak of what he had witnessed, but others spoke for him. The story of what happened to the Vorn Imperium spread across the galaxy faster than light itself, and every species heard the tale of 12,000 warships destroyed in 3 seconds. The lesson was learned. Humanity had not conquered the galaxy, and they had not demanded submission, and they had not claimed territory or resources or slaves. They had simply made the entire galaxy understand one simple truth: leave us alone, and the galaxy listened. The Wanderers continue. 50 years had passed since humanity first entered Concord space, and in that time, everything had changed. The nomad hung in the void near the edge of known space, preparing to continue its endless journey into the unknown. And behind it, a galaxy transformed, watched with emotions that ranged from relief to sorrow to something that felt almost like gratitude. Galactic Concord had reformed itself during those 50 years, and not because humanity had demanded changes, and not because anyone feared punishment for failing to improve. The change had come from within. Watching humanity had taught the thousand species of the Concord something they had never understood before. They had seen what a civilization could become when survival was all that mattered, and they had witnessed the terrible cost of being forged in endless war. And they had looked at humanity and seen a mirror that reflected uncomfortable truths. The humans did not want to be what they had become. They did not celebrate their power or take pride in their invincibility. They carried their strength like a burden, and they wore their survival like a scar, and they would have traded everything they had gained for the chance to go home to a world that no longer existed. This realization sparked something unexpected throughout the Concord species that had fought each other for millennia, began to question whether their ancient grudges were worth continuing civilizations that had competed for resources. Started exploring cooperation instead. Old enemies discovered that they had more in common than they had ever believed, and new alliances formed around shared hopes rather than shared fears. Wars ended across the galaxy, and not because anyone forced peace, but because intelligent beings finally asked themselves if there was another way. Grade flourished between former rivals, and borders that had been fortified for centuries softened into crossing points for travelers and merchants and scholars. The galaxy grew better, and humanity had done nothing to cause it except to exist. Ambassador Kelveth was very old now, and her scales had faded to a pale silver, and her movements were slow and careful, but her mind remained as sharp as it had been 50 years ago when she first saw the Nomad appear on her display screen. She traveled to the great fortress one final time because she wanted to say goodbye, and because she wanted to understand something that had puzzled her for half a century. She found Captain Yara Singh in the same garden where she had met with High Arbiter Morith all those years ago. Yara was ancient by human standards now, and her hair was pure white, and her face was lined with decades of service and sacrifice, but her eyes still held the same tired kindness that Kelveth remembered. The garden was tended by children who were probably Yara's grandchildren, or perhaps great-grandchildren, and they ran between the plants laughing and playing while their ancestors sat in quiet contemplation. You changed everything, Kelveth said as she settled into a chair beside the old human, simply by existing and simply by refusing to use what you have. You transformed our entire galaxy. Yara looked at her with genuine curiosity in her faded eyes. Did we? She asked, and her voice was soft and thoughtful. I think you changed yourselves, Ambassador. We just showed you that it was possible to be something better. Kelveth considered this response for a long time before speaking again. Where will you go now? She asked. Yara pointed toward the cosmic horizon where the stars thinned out and the vast darkness between galaxies stretched into infinity. Out there, she said, and her voice carried a mixture of anticipation and weariness. There is more to see, and there is more to learn, and maybe someday we will find a place to stop. She smiled, and it was the smile of someone who had accepted a fate they could not change, but probably not wandering. Is what we do now, it is who we have become. Kelveth felt a strange emotion rise in her chest, and she realized it was sadness. She was going to miss humanity, even though she had been terrified of them for most of the past 50 years. Will you come back? She asked. Yara considered the question carefully before answering. Maybe, she said, if you need us and if something threatens what you have built here, then we will return. Her expression grew serious. But I hope you will not need us, Ambassador. I hope you will be strong enough on your own. That is really all we ever wanted for anyone. She extended her hand in the human gesture of farewell, and Kelveth grasped it gently, feeling the fragile warmth of human skin beneath her scaled fingers. Take care of each other, Yara said. Learn from our mistakes. Build something beautiful and protect it with everything you have. And remember that true strength is not measured by what you can destroy. The Nomad began its departure sequence 1 hour later, and the great fortress moved slowly away from Concord space. with a majesty that made every being who watched feel small and humbled. Its drives glowed with energies beyond comprehension, and it gathered speed with a patience that suggested it had all the time in the universe, because it did. The galaxy watched as the Nomad grew smaller and smaller against the infinite backdrop of stars, until finally it vanished into the darkness between galaxies, where no Concorde vessel had ever traveled. They were gone. The wanderers had continued their endless journey into the unknown, and they had left behind a galaxy that was better than they had found it. Calveth returned to her duties with a strange peace in her heart, and she spent the remaining years of her life telling stories about the humans to anyone who would listen. She told them about Captain Yara Singh and her tired eyes and her kind smile. She told them about the children who played in gardens aboard a fortress that could destroy worlds. She told them about a species that had absolute power and chose mercy. 1,000 years later, those stories had become legends, and children across the galaxy heard tales of the wanderers who had visited their ancestors. They spoke of a species that had lost their world and built another from its corpse. They spoke of a fortress that traveled the stars, asking nothing and taking nothing. They spoke of a people who had every reason to hate the universe and chose to love it instead. And sometimes, on clear nights when the stars aligned, just write the stories. Said, you could still see Thema, dark shape, moving against the distant light, still wandering and still searching and still protecting the universe from things that lurked in the spaces between the nomad humanity's gift and burden. The mobile fortress of absolute power, crewed by a species that had learned the hardest truth the universe had to offer. True strength is not what you can destroy. True strength is what you choose to protect. And somewhere out in the infinite darkness between galaxies, the wanderers continued their journey, still searching for home, still hoping for peace, still human after everything they had endured. And that was perhaps the most remarkable thing of all.